Welcome to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks, channel 167. Great to have you with us. We have a fantastic show coming up this week. Another great guest in a month, a year that we've had amazing guests. Jon Reid will not disappoint you. Jon Reid is the president of the Toronto Police Association, representing thousands of police officers at the Toronto Police Service, both uniformed and non-uniformed. He has a real perspective on policing as somebody who's been involved in policing for decades. As you may know, if you listen to this show, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. It's my day job. I've been very lucky to be very successful at it. But I always think it's important to not drink the Kool-Aid on either side, to not let adversarial positions dominate my thinking or anybody else's. We'll get to that in a second in my opening statement. But I think after the death and shooting of Constable Andrew Hong, an officer killed in broad daylight, ambushed in a donut store just outside of Toronto, I thought it was important to have Jon on to talk about all the problems that I think currently exist with the criminal justice system, all the things that we don't talk about openly enough, and what kind of climate has been created to allow somebody to be ambushed in broad daylight in their uniform, targeted for being a police officer. And how do we get to that point where it's a 1 or 2 day news story where the Prime Minister doesn't attend the funeral? It's a 3 or 4 day news story. And on the day of the funeral, the Justice Minister in charge of sentencing in Canada basically abandons the mandatory minimums for the exact and similar kinds of gun crimes, even when it comes to possession of guns, that led to Andrew Hong's murder. So Jon Reid, the president of the Toronto Police Association, will be my guest for the full hour tonight after my opening statement. I think it's a conversation that you're really going to enjoy, especially if you're a person interested in law and order. And in this day of craziness and these days and ages of woke craziness, who isn't interested in law and order? Jon will be our guest, and you're going to hear it straight from the police perspective, which I think is often misunderstood, not valued, and in an era and a decade of defund the police idiocy, I'm hoping you're going to enjoy that conversation coming up in just about 10 to 12 minutes. Let's get to my opening statement of the week. You heard me talk a moment ago about partisanship, tribalism. Everything seems to come down to now which side you're on. I don't know how many of you listening to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks channel 167, or you can always find us on YouTube at the Ari Goldkind Show, saw the little Twitter exchange, the anti-social media exchange yesterday between Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, one of his diplomats, and Elon Musk. Now, I would say that Elon Musk knows more in his little finger about 95% of things in this world than any other so-called expert or genius knows about 5% of nothing. The reason I'm talking about that, because I find the war in Ukraine so stupid, such a waste of taxpayer money, such a dereliction of duty to Canadian American taxpayers. There was a hurricane last week. There are billions of federal dollars going more to the Ukraine than for 1 second to Florida. It really is astounding to me. You have one of the Russian diplomats responding to a tweet by Elon Musk talking about the steps that can lead to peace, to de-escalate nuclear war, to de-escalate the tension, to bring the temperature down, as some pundits say. This diplomat, who is also a lawyer, tells Elon Musk to go F himself. I'm being serious, to go F himself. Then Zelensky, on his Twitter profile, because clearly he's in the middle of a war but has lots of time to tweet and pose for Vogue and meet Ben Stiller and go on The Tonight Show, he then puts out a tweet which says, essentially, would you rather Elon Musk be on Ukraine's side or not be working for Russia? That's the binary here. That if you don't want a nuclear war, that you don't think NATO and Ukraine and all of these things are core US interests, you don't want taxpayer money thrown at Ukraine, billions of unaccounted for tax dollars, where the only people who get rich are Ukraine and the military industrial complex. Now Zelensky comes out today and says Musk is a Russian agent. That seems to be where we are in society today. Not this George Bush, you're with us or you're against us. It's you're either with us or you work for the other guy. Think of how intellectually dishonest and sickening that is. That if you ask questions, look at COVID 2 years ago. Everything that we're learning about COVID and vaccines and immunity and variants and infectiousness and transmission and all of the things that we're finding out, if you raised this a year or two ago, you would have been deplatformed. If you were a doctor raising questions about the efficacy of the vaccines, you would have been delicensed. If you were somebody talking about, wait a minute, vaccine used to mean you don't actually get the infection, it doesn't transmit to you if you have it, the dictionary changes to say, no, it just reduces serious hospitalization and death. What's my point linking COVID to the Ukraine? If you ask questions, if you push back at the narrative that people in power have, and if you don't follow the money, or if you do, let me be more specific, if you do follow the money, Pfizer, Moderna, no liability for side effects, can't be sued, the Ukraine, billions of dollars in armaments, billions of dollars to the military industrial complex, billions of dollars shipped to a country that we really have very little to do with. When Russia's interest is that Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO, threatening their sovereignty. If you even question that or say, follow the money, or Elon Musk has every right to tweet, let's turn the temperature down, the response is an interesting point. Here's why we shouldn't turn the temperature down. Interesting point. Here's why the war is so important to taxpayers in America, which nobody can ever make that argument for, by the way. Instead, it's F off from Zelensky's top lawyer and an international diplomat. That's literally the Twitter profile, hundreds of thousands of followers for this Ukrainian man. And Zelensky, 2 hours later, essentially calls Elon Musk a Russian plant or a Russian spy. It is so intellectually dishonest. It is so unseemly. It is the worst of an ad hominem attack. You can look up ad hominem, but it really is an attack on somebody personally when you can't argue their premise. You're not smart enough to debate them. You're not smart enough to out-argue them. You're not smart enough to put another side or counter them in a way that would make them look misinformed or foolish. So you essentially call them a name, sort of like in 2020, 21, 22, you call somebody racist when they make a point about anything that isn't woke. You don't debate them. They won't debate you. You'll want to debate them, but they'll get you canceled by calling you a name rather than saying your premise is untrue. This is, again, if you're listening to this across Canada, you might say, what do I care about this? Because tons of your money is going there. And so while house prices, housing, groceries, energy bills are going through the roof for you, your government is sending tens of millions of dollars to a country that we have no significant or compelling interest in. And if you disagree and say that we do you even understand? Maybe you do, but I don't think so. Just how hot the temperature is in getting that part of the world to cool down. And when Elon Musk, somebody who understands geopolitical affairs better than most of the people who run geopolitical affairs in the United States, tweets out a very respectful, here are 4 or 5 ideas that may lower the temperature. And the warmonger Zelensky, and make no mistake, he's a warmonger. I'm not going to get into it why tonight, but he's a warmonger. This war has been very good for him and his brand, a Kardashian-like word from the last few years. The idea that you can't ask questions in this society about anything, or to use the term I use in my business, that you're no longer allowed to cross-examine, because cross-examining would be offensive to the person you're seeking truth from. There is no more of an offensive breach or affront to democratic, liberal, and free speech tenets than the idea that you don't ask questions. You just suck it up, buttercup, and go along with what Twitter tells you to think. Let's get to a couple other things before we get to our guest for this show. You may have noticed, and the stories got a little bit of traction and then they disappeared, that China is buying farmland by the hundreds of thousands of acres in the United States of America. Why do you think that's happening? Why do you think it's the Chinese Communist Party's interest to buy hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland in America, often near military installations? Now, this is not a story that's buried. It comes up on CNN or the New York Times. It's there, but then it disappears after a couple hours. You would think in a sane society, we'd be more interested in that little nugget, which affects the food supply, sovereignty, national security, than being concerned about whether the Kardashians are premiering on Disney Plus this week. But unfortunately, there'll be more people interested in watching Disney Plus this week and the premiere of the Kardashians than wondering about food security and national sovereignty in North America. It is astounding to me how distracted, that's the point of why I raised this, how distracted of a society we have become. Lastly, a little story that you're going to compare the attention it got to the little headline yesterday that you didn't see. You'll remember, no matter what province you're in Canada throughout the Sirius XM Canada Talks world, that there was a pastor and a member of provincial parliament who was charged criminally for being a pastor, having church services during COVID, having more than the 10 or 25 people at a gathering. I think it was even outside. The details don't really matter. Remember, strip clubs were allowed to be open, liquor stores allowed to be open, beer stores allowed to be open. But if you wanted to practice Christianity, that's a bridge too far. And these people were charged criminally. It was major, major headline news. And lo and behold, just a couple days ago, all the charges were dropped because the Crown said it's not in the public interest to proceed. If that isn't a great or a greater metaphor for what's gone on in the last 2 or 3 years with so much of our nonsense, I don't know what it is, but you certainly heard about the arrest. You didn't hear about the dropping of the charges, and that should tell you something. Back in 2 minutes with Jon Reid, Law and Order time on the Ari Goldkind Show. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks, channel 167. From time to time, I always think it's important to go right to the source, to the horse's mouth, when you hear about law and order, crime, and policing in Canada. As I said at the top of the show, Jon Reid is the president of the Toronto Police Association. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Given what's going on in Toronto and throughout the country when it comes to the uptick in particularly violent crime, I thought it was a very important time to have Jon back on the show. Jon, great to have you back on Sirius XM Canada Talks.
Ari, thank you very much for having me on today.
So there's so much to get into, Jon. And first of all, just to set the scene for maybe 30 seconds, tell people exactly what your role is as of the president of the TPA versus, for example, being the chief of police.
So in my function as president of the Toronto Police Association, we're essentially the labor organization that represents almost 8,000 men and women of the Toronto Police Service. And those men and women are both sworn and unsworn, which means they're police officers and civilians. And the civilians are a very, very important component for the service as well. They kind of look after what's going on in the background of the service, and they're very crucial to us, as are obviously the frontline men and women. We look after labor issues that may come up, but also we're responsible for representing their interests, such as their health and safety. And I truly believe things like violent crime, gun crime, bail reform, which I'm sure we're going to chat about, are pieces where that impacts their health and safety.
All right, so that's a perfect segue or lead into where I want to go. A lot of topics to discuss on this week's show. Let's start with what brought me to reach out to you again, which was, I thought, a shooting and a murder of a Toronto police officer that I worried would be news for 2 or 3 days, then it would disappear out. We've become blasé and desensitized to it. Constable Andrew Hong, as you well know, Jon, but just for people listening across North America, everywhere Sirius plays, may not know that Andrew Hong was ambushed as he was in a donut shop having his lunch by a man carrying, for example, one of these illegal guns we'll talk about throughout the show, but then ambushed and shot at point blank by a monster who had a history with the law. I read what his daughter said. I'm sure you saw that post, John, and I thought there should be no, and let me be very frank about this, John. You know that my views are sort of not the orthodoxy in my profession, should be mandatory reading by every criminal defense lawyer or other in the country. What is your take on what happened to Andrew Hong? How did we get to that point? And I know this is probably too existential or philosophical a question. I worry that he dies in vain and nothing changes. What are your feelings on the whole situation?
So I can tell you, Ari, I can tell you all of our members, myself, I think the policing profession across Canada was stunned by what happened. You know, we've heard of those instances, unfortunately, taking place down in the U.S., not up here in Canada,
right?
Not in this manner. You know, and as you pointed out, to have a police officer murdered, the middle of the day in a Tim Hortons in a coffee shop, just having his lunch, is unbelievable. And I have the same concern you have. And I want to make sure that this terrible, tragic murder does not just fall into the history books. I want to make sure the public are aware of it. I keep talking about it. And it is also important to remember that the individual who murdered Andrew also went on to murder two other civilians.
Hard-working people, which I always think should be a very important part of the story, not some gang-banging shooting. For those who don't know, John, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're quite right to bring it up. He murdered a very hard-working car mechanic who's not on the dole, not on welfare, not part of a family man, and another young person. And to me, you're right. I'm focused on Andrew Hong, but you're right to point out exactly who he shot. And in Canada, you know, there just seems to be an acceptance. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted people to understand who the other two people he shot were.
Yeah, and I want to elaborate on that because it is important for the public to recognize that this is the murder of a police officer in full uniform, but also this individual went on to shoot a motorist in the stomach twice, mind his own business driving down the street during a carjacking, then went to that business, shot and killed two other people and another individual before being apprehended by Hamilton police several hours later. But it's really important, I think, for the public to understand what's going on here. The level of crime and criminality is on the rise, I believe, in certain situations. And we've seen that out west, where we had those two brothers murder 10 people.
The Sandersons.
Yes. And the public needs to pay attention to this. I think we need to look at, our parole system, our bail system, our sentencing provisions, to try and move things forward. And that's something we've been doing with Canadian Police Association, is trying to bring it to the forefront federally to exact some kind of change for the betterment.
Well, you talked about federally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I noticed on the day of Andrew Hong's funeral, in addition to, again, people really should seek out what his daughter wrote about her father, if it's not a wake-up call. And again, I know this intimately because of what I've done for 2 decades. Now, you and I do it on the other side of the fence, but it always bothers me, and I'm sure you know, I've gotten heat that I never care about for not drinking the Kool-Aid of my profession. One of the things that's always bothered me, John, and maybe you can take it from here, is on my side of the fence, or among very left-wing politicians who are the defund the police morons and numbnuts and all of this. We'll talk about Minneapolis, which is now Murderopolis, as we go. But I always feel that crime has never touched them. It's always something that happens to somebody else, maybe somebody at Jane and Finch, maybe Andrew Hong. And I always think to myself, would you have the same far left positions that everybody should come out of jail, the jail sentences should be weak, parole should be a third, if God forbid your wife or your kids were carjacked, or your wife and kid were shot in the stomach as they drive down Yonge Street, or your wife and kid, God forbid, were home invaded or violated. I always think, and I'm interested in your policing view of this because I have a bit of a passion to this, that it should make no difference whether the crime happened to somebody you don't know or if it happened to you, for you to think that the number one thing a government should do in a civilized society is protect people when they can be protected. Not everything is going to be stopped. We're not stupid, but from the violent. And I see a movement in society, particularly Canadian society, away from that, John. And the reason I mention Andrew's funeral is that's the same day Lametti was standing up in the House of Commons, getting rid of all sorts of mandatory minimums for serious gun offenses. And I thought the irony was extraordinarily thick.
Yeah, so I very much agree with you. And I think if you look at, so in the Canadian society, we've looked at rehabilitation. Probably that was kind of introduced during the 70s.
Yeah.
And we've always tried to kind of push that forward, I think. And there is value in it for certain individuals. But we do have those individuals that will never, ever abide by Canadian laws. They have no concern about your safety, my safety. And you also raise a very, very important piece, which I always hit on, is the directly affected. And to your point, we should not have to wait until people are directly affected for them to start caring. A lot of the instances we have now with gun violence and gunplay, especially across the 401 in the city of Toronto, during these shootings, there's a lot of stray rounds flying around, unfortunately. I was watching the news yesterday last night in Chicago. A 3-year-old boy was in a car with a bunch of other kids, shot dead. These are things that happen in the US. And unfortunately, a lot of the trends from the US, they make their way up here to Canada. And I think, Andrew's murder was basically a hallmark. These things can and will happen up here in Canada, but we have to make sure we have the proper laws and bail reform and parole positions in place. They're not going to stop crime. We're not going to be able to stop people shooting each other. Murder's illegal. People still murder each other. People are going to go to jail for a long time. But I think we have to do our very best to try and rein these in. I look at Andrew Hong's particular situation with that firearm that's used to kill him. I don't believe that firearm, if that individual had it, he would have changed his mind upon what he did. But maybe if we'd had stronger laws to prohibit having them, or even the threat of going to jail for an extended period of time, maybe that individual may not have had it to give to this individual.
And it's an important point, and I'm not going to get too wonky into case law, but you may have noticed, or at least through your association, there was a case out of the Supreme Court, I'd say about 3 months ago, called Bissonnette. It was the mosque shooter, and you'll recall, and then I want to move to your point about federal and how do you stop crime, because obviously nobody's utopian or unicorn-like in their thinking. But, we live in a country, and I was outspoken about this, caught heat for it, didn't care. I really just don't care. I speak what I believe is the truth. And, I'm sure that power will be removed from me in due course as Canada becomes less liberal, less democratic, and less free. But this is a Supreme Court that said, if you're a serial killer or a mosque shooter, or you're a Paul Bernardo, every life you take, John, isn't going to be worth a consecutive period of parole ineligibility. In other words, you can kill 1, 2, 5, 10, right after the first, it makes no difference. And the language I'm sure is the Supreme Court said it would be cruel and unusual to prevent a serial killer from ever applying for parole. That to me reflects a culture of who's at the top of the totem pole in terms of priorities in this country. And rehabilitation, Section 718 of the code, I think your point is taken sort of an overarching priority over denunciation, deterrence, things that nobody can prove really work. But I want to take you to the Sandersons for a moment, because you mentioned out west. You familiar with the term dangerous offender?
Yes.
All right. So I want to give you, because you're the guest, let me set it up this way. After that carnage, and by the way, where he butchered his own people, that's a really important part of the story. And everything is very left-wing now and politically correct, and you can't talk about who does crime and the numbers and the stats. But he butchered his own people, Miles Sanderson and his brother, and he had 59 previous convictions, many if not most, for violence. If there's ever a flag to the Crown Attorney's Office that you work very closely with, I work very closely with, you are essentially, not you, but essentially these Sanderson brothers were being sent out into the community, and the community is their guinea pigs. How can you have public safety where you're giving somebody a 60th chance that everybody knows is a ticking time bomb?
So I think what we have to do is you have to look at individuals' pattern of conduct. I think it's the old saying that, people's past actions will show what they're probably going to be doing in the future. And back to my point about certain individuals will not change the way they act, and they will be a danger to society now, and they may be in the future. And I think the courts, the government, they have to take a serious look at this and look at the point of at what point do we declare somebody a dangerous offender and keep them in jail? Because the public needs to be protected. The job of the government should be to protect the public, make sure they're safe, so you and I can go about our daily lives without having to worry about being shot, being attacked.
And one of the things about that, I'm going to bring it down south, but then I'm going to come back to a bit of a different question, is I don't know if you know the name Eliza Fletcher. Does that name ring a bell to you?
No, it doesn't.
All right. That's not a trick question, by the way. She is the young jogger in Tennessee, a kindergarten teacher from a lovely family, white lady, who was murdered, butchered, kidnapped by a black man who was very similar to Sanderson, out early from a kidnapping charge. She's the jogger who was killed in the morning by this man. And, some of the far left response to it was, well, why was she out jogging in the morning? Why would she be out jogging in the morning? As if that's an answer to these people. And I find it absolutely galling that now demographics, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on it, it's too hot button, but demographics have sort of come into play with what crimes are acceptable, which make headline news, which disappear in 2 seconds, which gets Twitter going crazy. And that's an insult to all people, because as I'm sure you and I have talked about in the past, Jon, when I did a little political thing 8 years ago that changed my life, and I had this somewhat anti-police rhetoric about me 8 years ago for reasons I won't bore you with, every time I go to a low-income community and I'd say the police this and the police that and less funding for police, people would look at me and say, we actually want more police here in Toronto community housing. We'd like to see more police cars coming through here so that our kid can walk down a street the same way you do in Forest Hill. And that had a very enlightening effect on me. Let me give you a more open question, because I don't want this to be a rant because these things really bother me, because I see them almost in a way that Toronto police don't. You get to interview them, where a lot of the times they're full of crap with you, or, my mom did it, or the dog ate my homework. Whereas I have a different vantage point to it, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but I'm sure people can figure out what I'm saying. Why does somebody in this day and age, and I want to give you time to answer this, and then we'll take a break and come back with some hot button issues. From a Toronto Police Association point of view, knowing what police officers make, which is way more in this country than areas in the States where they're woefully underpaid. And it's unbelievable how little they're paid to deal with what they have to deal with in parts of Georgia, South Carolina, Missouri, Oklahoma. Why does somebody now who may have woken up in the morning and spent their life with a family member who's a police officer, their uncle, their mother, their grandfather, why does somebody now say, I want to be a police officer, with all the headache, second guessing, people yelling at them on the street? We have body cams now. I'll get into that maybe if we have time. But I really understood 30 years ago why you wanted to help people and serve and protect. Now, if I had a kid, I'm in no danger of having one, but if I had a kid who wanted to be a police officer, the way the streets are turning more mean, more violent, more this and more that, I might say, maybe you should go do something else for similar money where you're not going to be hated and you're not going to be killed. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I can tell you. So I've been a police officer for 34 years. It is the best job ever. I've always loved policing. It's a very, very rewarding job as well. The question as to why somebody would want to get into policing now, I would agree with you. We do have a problem these days recruiting. It's hard to find people that you want to be a police officer, especially what's happened over the last couple of years with the anti-police narrative that was kind of pushed up from the US here to Canada. And there were a lot of problems pushed up from the US to Canada that we don't have. But I can tell you that seems to be kind of, I think, dying down now, that rhetoric. People are looking at police officers now and realizing, I think, the very, very important job they do for society. And it's a very difficult job to be a police officer. It's very difficult on the officers themselves, but also on the families. You as soon as you sign up to be a police officer, You can kiss your Christmases goodbye, birthdays, holidays, all these different things. And obviously there's that risk. You leave every day, and we have only seen what happened the last 3 weeks. There is possibility you may not come home. And I can tell you that is the worst news you have to impart to a family. But that's a risk of the profession. But that does not dissuade our men and women from going out there every day and doing their best and working with communities. To your other point there, where you're talking about when you went in some of the communities and wanted police officers there, I totally agree with you. We have a lot of support for our police officers out there, but it's a very quiet support, unfortunately.
The silent majority.
Yep. And what I want to do, I want to try and change that. Because I can tell you, 20 years ago when I was policing, people were happy to come up and chat with you and talk to you. That kind of went away over the last few years, but I do believe it's coming back now. And we have to make it okay to acknowledge the police and make sure police are properly funded, trained, and supported, and staffed. These are critical pieces to make sure we are available to deal with whatever we have to deal with on a daily basis. Because when all is said and done, we are the go-to for everything in the end when no one else is around.
Let's take a quick break on the Ari Goldkind Show. Back on 2 minutes, and we're going to ask Jon a more positive question to follow up what he just said about what's rewarding about being a police officer. Back in 2 minutes on the Ari Goldkind Show with Jon Reid, president of the Toronto Police Association. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks, channel 167, with Jon Reid, president of the Toronto Police Association. Some really passionate, and to me, the things I think about the most, not just because of my job, but from a political point of view. Let me go back to something you said, Jon. Let's turn the negative upside down for a minute. Tell people who are listening, who don't often hear that viewpoint, why is policing one of the more rewarding jobs in Toronto, in Ontario, in Canada, in North America? Your view of it, unfiltered.
So one of the things that attracted me to policing, quite frankly, was the reality that you never know how your day is going to go. You never know what you're going to be involved in. Doing frontline policing, you go out in the morning, you're in your scout car, and you have no control over what comes over that radio. And the reality is, for every police officer, whatever comes up you're assigned to, that is your job. Your job is to go and deal with that. And I think it's very challenging. And that's, I think, one of the important pieces people have to understand. It could be anything very minor, from a neighbor dispute to going to an armed bank robbery. And these decisions, or a domestic situation in which there's violence and weapons, our officers have to attend these situations. They have to make split-second decisions sometimes as to whether or not to take a life or not. And that's at kind of the highest threshold, I think. But, policing is a very dynamic, interesting piece. I talk to the recruits all the time, and I tell them, you are signing up for a job where you're going to see the best of your colleagues. You're going to see the best of the public. We're also going to see the worst in people. And the problem is, for our members as well, that piece for the worst things you come across, you can never erase those. Those are going to be with you for the rest of your life. And one of the important things we're striving to do is try and make sure when these officers come on the job, that they leave as close to perfect as when they got on the job. That's a key important piece for me with the mental health aspect of it.
Is that possible?
I think you will always be tainted by what you've seen over your life. But I think it's very important to try and do the very best we can and provide the supports we can. We all do our best. And that's my intent. That's the intent of the Toronto Police Association, to get that done.
Let me come to what I'm going to qualify, in my own estimation, as a more boring question, but I think is an important one. Then I want to move to a little bit about defund the police, a little bit about bail reform and probation, or parole as we move forward. But let me give you a question that may feel a little bit boring, but I think it's an important one. It's easy for you and I and the news at 6, or Twitter, which is still anti-social media, the opposite of anything social, to focus on shootings, carjackings, which to me only became big when Mitch Marner, a Toronto Maple Leaf, was carjacked. If you were just an ordinary Joe in Leaside or on Bayview or somewhere, and you're carjacked, to me, it was when it happened to Mitch Marner, it became carjacking, which to me is problematic. I don't know that we'll have time to get to a question about that. But as a defense lawyer, as somebody who looks at the dockets of court and is very lucky to be extraordinarily busy in my profession, I see a lot of non-violent crimes going sort of unheeded, not very hugely prosecuted. Frauds, money laundering, trafficking, identity theft, all these things that have a real, actual calculable toll, not just financially, but on people's lives, their ability to trust, to move through society electronically, banking. But the money laundering and the financial crime and mortgage crime, it's something that I see growing. Now, I don't know if that's because it's a snapshot of people that come to me and I'm biased in that. Is that something you're seeing in policing as we move more and more electronic, more and more stupid crypto, more and more people oversharing their data, less going into the bank loan manager and doing some paper? I'm curious as your take on it, because when I see people who have been defrauded, sometimes through their own naivete, other times through something more sophisticated, I tend to see prosecutors dropping those cases more, not taking them all the way through more, not having investigative resources, the RCMP, the fraud, the white collar, the casinos in Richmond Hill. I know it's not a juicy subject. I'm aware of that. But I'm curious as to your take on if you're seeing what I'm seeing.
So I don't have any stats as far as whether those crimes are going up or down. I would suspect that they are going up, especially as we move further and further into kind of electronic age, and everything's data driven. But I think you really do hit on a really good point from the point of view of a lot of the people are impacted. They may not be physically hurt, but the financial toll some of these crimes take on people is devastating. Wiping out people's retirement funds, especially when we have older Canadians who are picked on with either phone scams or email scams.
Or the driveway scam is one I've seen a lot in the last little while.
Yeah, I've seen driveway, hot water heaters and things like that. And the problem with these are resources. And I realize, policing, it's a police function to follow up these crimes, but we need the staff to complete them. And these investigations, unfortunately, if you apprehend somebody with a firearm, they've got the gun or they don't have the gun. It's very, very difficult because a lot of the frauds, they're after the fact. So now you're chasing down paper. Was the old way. You're trying to find the documents, but now we're trying to find digital paperwork, a digital footprint, which the accused may or may not have left, and they're far more intense and far more specialized. And then we also need experts to make sure they can dig into this. Then experts, as you are well aware, have to be able to present it to the court and possibly present it to a jury.
Yeah.
And I can't really address why the Crowns aren't proceeding, but I can tell you that we do need more resources as far as policing goes to investigate these crimes, and it's an important piece.
I think so too. And crime changes, the response to crime has to change. And it's something I see a lot. I mean, I've seen huge prosecutions, huge millions of dollars of taxpayer money. And I never liked the term government money, or, you saw the other day, Krista Freeland said there was $10 billion surplus for the government. Well, that's taxpayer money. Mm-hmm. And when you spend $2-3 million on the prosecution of some late night casino, where the rich person who's 100 times richer than any ordinary average taxpayer is running a casino out of a mansion that's gated in Richmond Hill with lions, tigers, and bears, and it falls apart on the morning of because there's some really great lawyering, it makes me wonder about that. And, I think those kinds of crimes are going to become more frequent, not less. Let me pivot a little bit to something very timely. I don't want to spend too much time on it because there are juicier subjects to come in the next few minutes, but it's an election time in Toronto. I don't really think there's an election. I mean, I think it's obvious, and I think Mayor Tory has no competition, which I think is awfully sad. And I think whatever competition he has is by and large delusional, that they want to move even more left-wing and more leftward than he, who plays it down the middle very well. I mean, he's a very decent man who I think very highly of, but he pleases everybody, which has a risk and a reward to it. Clearly he's being rewarded, but the risk is to the city. In terms of the relationship with different levels of government, from your point of view, other than obviously complaining about it, which is easy to do, what have you felt has engendered a positive and helpful response from the mayor's office, or perhaps up to Queen's Park or federally? And what do you feel has been ignored to the peril of the people you serve and protect?
So one thing we do at the association now is we have to engage with all levels of government directly. It's really, really important to have those relationships with government, have that exchange of information, thoughts, and ideas. One thing I also try and pride ourselves on is instead of just coming to the government with complaints, we try and come with solutions.
That's why I asked it that way. You're wise.
Yep.
I asked,
Yep.
That's exactly why I asked it. I'm curious as to what those solutions are from your point of view.
So it kind of really does depend on what we're speaking about as far as which piece. If we talk about something such as bail reform, we need obviously tighter bail, I think, rules. We've had individuals where they're out on multiple firearm bails, which blows my mind. I think, quite honestly, if somebody's already been arrested with one gun and released and they get caught with a second gun, how they get out, I have no idea.
Do you think the public, just as I interrupt you, I want you to keep going. Do you think the public genuinely understands just how often that happens?
No, I don't.
All right, please.
I think a lot of this stuff, it doesn't get reported, I think, fairly enough. But once again, I think the public needs to make sure that they are paying attention to what's going on, because these situations, although today they're safe, we have to be very careful, I think, to make sure things don't proliferate. And the gun crime, unchecked, will get further out of control. And I think it's so important for us to make sure we speak to the government. You mentioned before about the federal government winding down mandatory minimums. I don't agree with that. Like, people need to understand, people need to be responsible for their actions. I understand rehabilitation. I understand people making mistakes, making bad decisions. That's human nature. But if someone's continuing to commit crimes, especially violent crimes, at that point, we have to stop, have a look at this seriously, and decide what is best for the individual, but more importantly, what is best for society.
Do you think, and I've often thought it, I've said it publicly, and again, I do many of these bails. I'm very good at it. I don't hide it from any listener. I mean, there are circumstances where there's a difference between a guy who's got a loaded gun in his waistband versus his girlfriend who's in the car with him that may or may not know. I mean, there are degrees of nuance, and by and large, judges and justices of the peace try and do the best they can. But my complaint and concern, and look, John, let's be honest, I've done very well financially in this world. I live in an area of the city that has been immune to the. I think that will change. I think the crime will spread into previously immune areas of Canada. But I question whether justices and JPs, because they don't live in Regent Park, they don't live in Thorncliffe Park, they don't live at Jane and Finch, they don't live at Toronto Community Housing. There seems to me to be a bit of an elite or ivory tower. I'm not throwing shade. I'm friends with many judges. I think they're all very sincere in what they do and what they want to do. But I just think there's a difference between whether you feel, touch, worry about getting in your car, worry about walking to the park with your kid because you live in Rosedale, versus if you lived in an area where you're, wondering if somebody's going to come up to you, or if there's going to be a bullet whizzing by. Do you think there's anything to that? And it's a function of an insulated bench? Or am I just completely off on Space Mountain, which may be the case?
I would tend to agree with you. I think one of the things, like our members each and every day, they respond to shootings and murders, unfortunately, almost on a daily basis, and stabbings. They see and experience and live the trauma that these communities live each and every day. And they see the impact and the knock-on effect it has in the communities and the devastation it causes families. And that's what our people see. But once it gets to court, as you're well aware, things become somewhat sanitized. Obviously, there are some cases where you have either photographic, video, or a witness where some of the impacts imparted to the court, but it's not the reality. It's not seeing what's really, really going on and experiencing the devastation that these shootings and stabbings and these crimes are causing in our city. And I think that's one of the important pieces. I think it would be fantastic if the judiciary saw what was going on, experienced this firsthand.
See, and it's funny that you say that, because I've gotten into this discussion with people I work with whose brains I trust. I don't think there's a visceral, and that's the word I use, John. I don't think there's a visceral reaction when you have this circus. It really is a circus of victim impact statements. It's complete theater. The decision is written on sentencing before the victim even says anything. That's very different. I've done cases, I've seen cases where a judge will see the shooting happen. They'll see the kid's brain be blown off. And only then does that human, this is a person that may need to be separated from society, come into play. And like, as a criminal defense lawyer, I will show my own bias here. It's fine. I'm obsessed with nobody who's innocent being convicted. That's my obsession in this business. It's the Me Too movement, that if I say Jon Reid sexually assaulted somebody 25 years ago, you're going to have to step down. You're going to get tarred and feathered. Look at Michael Thompson the other day. Look at the guy from the Army whose name escapes me, the vaccine, Fortin maybe. An allegation is enough to destroy a life. That's my obsession as a criminal lawyer, with somebody who just needs to be dealt fairly with by the system and prosecuted fairly, or didn't do it. That's where I go into overdrive. When it comes to sentencing, there seems to be this element in my business and throughout the criminal justice system, which I sometimes call the criminal injustice system, depending on what view you have, where there's just this reluctance to accept that some people in life, John, are just born good. They wouldn't harm a fly. You could do the worst things to them and they're not going to lash out. Then there are people, as you mentioned, that are incorrigible for whatever reason, but the public, and often women, and pets and children, will become their ticking time bomb. The people who are least likely to defend themselves. They're not going to go up to a UFC fighter. They're not going to go up to a bouncer at a club. But it's the weakest amongst us. And there's a resistance to this idea that maybe some people just shouldn't breathe the same air as you and I. I saw that over the last 3 years of Defund the Police insanity, Minneapolis getting, what kind of idiot couldn't have predicted that when you get rid of cops, what kind of literally idiot? So my question is, from a Toronto Police Association point of view, as somebody who lobbies, has a political bent to this, you're not just a beat cop. What do you think reverses the pendulum back to sanity?
So I think the first and foremost piece is the public support. The politicians are driven by the public, by the constituents. They get their marching orders from the constituents. And I think if we're able to garner enough vocal public support for change and support in policing, that will impact and empower the politicians of the day to make the right decisions, to make the decisions that will keep families safe here in Toronto, and hopefully keep individuals that should not be on the street locked up. I think we have to look kind of inside, within Toronto. If we see an individual that is repeatedly committing violent crimes again and again and again, they're not going to change. And I think part of the problem we run into more recently in society is that people aren't being held accountable for their actions. If there's some other kind of underlying instance or condition or something that's caused this, we need to make sure we look at that, absolutely. But if their actions aren't corrected, they will continue to do the same thing and continue to harm law-abiding, normal citizens here in Toronto. And we cannot let that stand. I can tell you, our men and women are out each and every day doing their very, very best to keep everybody safe. And my job is to make sure I keep my members safe and they keep the public safe.
Last question, about 60 seconds left before we have to wind up. I always thought body cameras would be really important. There was a heavy movement into Toronto with body cameras. I get tons of disclosure of body cameras. I know there was a lot of pushback many years ago. My view is that sunlight is the best antiseptic, so long as the viewer is sane, not partisan and not tribal, which again is a big caveat. In your view, in your role, has the rise of body cameras being a positive or negative effect on your members, and why?
So body cams have been a positive impact on our members. Like any new technology, I think everyone was a little hesitant at first. They've actually played a very, very big part in clearing up a lot of complaints, a lot of issues, laying out exactly what transpired in a particular incident. That said, though, they're not the be-all and end-all. Body cameras don't show you the tension in somebody's body before a struggle starts.
Right.
Body cameras don't catch all the information. So I think although they provide a window to what's going on, they can't be counted on as kind of a single source of the events. There's certain other things that will transpire as a result of body cams, and to make sure that's also taken in as far as giving some kind of like bigger picture to the situation.
Well, let's end that. If I was cross-examining you on the stand, I would have to admit that that's a very reasonable answer. So I think it's a good place to stop, because I think that too. And I've seen, even when there's cell phone footage, you'll see people on my side saying it doesn't tell the full story. I just always think sunlight is the best antiseptic. But as the caveat I said to you, it assumes, which you can't assume in this day and age anymore, that the viewer is sane. Jon Reid is the president of the Toronto Police Association. Jon, thanks for coming on. And we could scratch the surface of 100 more topics, and we should do it again. I appreciate you being here. I want to thank everybody for listening this week. Hopefully you enjoyed the chat between the president of the Toronto Police Association and a Toronto criminal lawyer. The irony of that is good, and I think there should be a lot more of these conversations across the aisle. If you're listening to us live, the Bilal Vakani Hour is coming up right after the show Tuesday, if you're listening to us live. And thanks for listening to us as we repeat throughout the week and watching us on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody.